Lost Egyptian pharaohs. In 2014, archaeologists discovered the tombs of 4 mysterious Egyptian pharaohs representing a previously unknown dynasty near the ancient cemetery of Abydos, located roughly 300 miles south of Cairo. Wall inscriptions identified one of the deceased as Woseribre Senebkay, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. He lived sometime between 1650 and 1550 BC. And suffered a brutal death at the hands of axe-wielding assailants who administered 18 blows to his neck, back, and legs. A skeletal analysis helped researchers theorize that Senebkay was likely attacked while on horseback, causing him to fall to the ground. The killers stabbed and slashed the pharaoh with such force, their axes penetrated his bone. In the words of archaeologist Joseph Wegner, who spoke with National Geographic about the findings, someone really wanted him dead. He believes that Senebkay died in an ambush or in battle, although it's possible that he was murdered by political rivals. He was between the ages of 35 and 40 and stood somewhere between 5'7" and 6 feet tall, making him unusually tall for his time. During Egypt's second intermediate period, when Senebkay lived and died, the culture experienced reduced material wealth and political fragmentation, with societies to the north and south of the Nile being divided into rival kingdoms. Experts failed to identify the other 3 pharaohs buried near him, but believe they were from the same time period. The lost kings are waiting to be reunited with their names. These tombs represent the first material proof of the mysterious Abydos dynasty, and archaeologists believe there are many more discoveries waiting to be made. Pet Cemetery. The world's oldest known pet cemetery is located in the Roman port city of Berenice, and it shows that the ancients treated their animals well, at least here, according to a newly published study, which claims that people tended to their injured pets carefully and even fed special food to critters who had lost their teeth. The analysis of the remains of 585 companion animals shows that they were laid to rest in individual burials with grave goods and collars, with many being covered in textiles or pottery. Surprisingly, only 5% of the burials are made up of dogs, while 90% were cats, many of which were found wearing iron collars or glass and shell necklaces. While dogs comprise a stark minority of the cemetery's inhabitants, evidence shows that they were treated equally well by their guardians during their lifetimes. The dogs lived a long time, often suffering from ailments that would have made survival on their own impossible, including gum disease, joint issues, and injuries incurred long before death. Dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, the cemetery was discovered beneath a Roman garbage dump just outside the city's walls. When the site's first study was published in 2016, many experts reportedly wondered whether the graves actually constitute a pet cemetery or if they were simply the discarded remains of animals who didn't mean much to their owners. The new findings shed unprecedented light on the relationship between humans and animals in ancient Egypt, which includes monkeys in addition to cats and dogs. Monkeys were buried with just as much care and consideration as their feline and canine counterparts, with grave goods and at least one specimen wrapped in a woolen blanket. These burials are distinct from other ancient graveyards, showing that they had special meaning to the people who put them there, and filling a crucial gap in our understanding of our relationship with not only our best friend, but other creatures as well. Mysterious Pyramid. The skeleton of a young girl has been discovered buried next to one of the most mysterious pyramids in all of Egypt. According to information released by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, the girl is estimated to have been around 13 years old when she died. She was found buried beside the Meidum Pyramid, partially collapsed and largely neglected. This is not a very famous archaeological site, despite the pyramid being impressive and old. The Meidum Pyramid was built 4,600 years ago as a step pyramid, before later being converted into a pyramid with smooth surfaces. After being turned into a true pyramid, it was about 300 feet tall. Archaeologists believe it was built for the pharaoh Snefru, who reigned between 2575 and 2551 BC. This guy actually built quite a few pyramids throughout the area, with scientists and historians suggesting he had been trying to figure out how to build the perfect pyramid through trial and error. It was Snefru's son and successor Khufu who would go on to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. As for the young girl, she was found in a cemetery beside the pyramid with her bones positioned as if she had been squatting when buried. Inside the cemetery, archaeologists also found a pair of severed bull heads and 3 ceramic vessels. However, they can't quite figure out who the girl was, or why she was buried so close to the pyramid. She may have had some kind of relation to the pharaoh Snefru. Ancient Phoenician shipwreck. Underwater archaeologists working with the University of Malta recently announced an amazing discovery. They found the remains of a spooky sunken merchant vessel from the days of the Phoenician Empire. This ship was discovered in the murky water near the island of Gozo in Malta. Who were the Phoenicians? They were the direct descendants of the ancient Canaanite people spoken of in the Bible. Today, their descendants have been traced to people living in modern-day Syria and Lebanon. The Phoenicians excelled in maritime activities, meaning they had one of the highest levels of technology when it came to building ships anywhere in the ancient world. Phoenicians used galleys and even invented the bireme, which is a galley with 2 decks of oars to be rowed even faster. The Phoenicians had a stable trading network all throughout the entire Mediterranean, including the nations of North Africa, Sicily, and Babylon between 1550 and 500 BC. The shipwreck just discovered came from around 700 BC and was located at a depth of about 375 feet. The ship sank about 200 years before the eventual decline of the Phoenicians. Scientists believe the vessel was going from Sicily to Malta at the time it was sunk. However, it's not exactly clear how the ship was sunk or what kind of interesting goods were being swapped between these two ancient nations. When did the Phoenicians arrive to Malta? So far, underwater archaeologists have discovered about 20 grinding stones, which may have been used in blacksmith work. They also discovered 50 amphorae, which were ancient pottery containers used to hold a variety of different things. These were discovered scattered throughout the sand on the bottom of the sea floor, and are now homes for all kinds of sea creatures. Unknown woman of the Seine. Did you know that CPR dummies are modeled after a real person? The standard face used on CPR dummies since the 1960s, known as Resusci Anne, is nicknamed the most kissed face in the world. But the inspiration behind these features is kind of shocking. During the 1880s, the body of a girl no more than 16 years old was pulled from the River Seine in Paris. It's believed that she committed suicide, but even though it was widely publicized at the time, nobody ever came forward to identify her, leaving the circumstances surrounding her life and death largely a mystery. The woman's face was unusually peaceful and calm, and she showed no signs of trauma despite her possibly tragic demise. Her features were so captivating, the pathologist who examined her made a plaster cast of her face. As creepy as it may sound, the woman's likeness went on to inspire artists and became a popular household decoration. Despite how iconic she became, her identity was never determined, and her death mask was catalogued in 1926 as the Unknown Woman of the Seine. It is worth considering that the woman's body was found at a time when sex workers were turning up dead fairly often in the River Seine, offering a possible clue to her past. But police reportedly shied away from associating her death with foul play, making it entirely possible that the face we've all come to know in safety training courses the world over once belonged to a prostitute who was perhaps tragically murdered. Unfortunately, we will probably never know. Mud mummy. A study published in February of this year reveals the unexpected discovery of a so-called mud mummy, suggesting that encasing deceased individuals in mud was a money-saving method of preparing people of lower societal ranking for the afterlife. Mummification was an expensive and long process that typically involved imported materials, and not everyone could afford it. This new discovery indicates that cheaper, locally sourced alternatives were available, like mud. The mummy, which dates back to around 1207 BC, was donated to the University of Sydney in 1860, and the sarcophagus it came in, which dates back to around 1000 BC, does not belong to the same person. According to the researchers, antiquities traders likely placed a mummified body into an unrelated coffin in an attempt to sell a more complete set. That was popular back in the day, and it apparently worked. While it's the only known mummy to be encased in mud, the discovery testifies to mummification being a custom among all social classes, with people of lesser means improvising through the use of alternative materials. Oldest tattoo tools. It turns out that tattoos may have begun life in Tennessee. As strange as that is to hear, according to Science News, the oldest known tattoo tools anywhere in the world have just been found at an ancient archaeological site in Tennessee. The tools were crafted from turkey leg bones and were used to give tattoos at least 3,600 years ago. In fact, turkey bones were used by Native Americans as far back as 5,000 years ago. making the indigenous people in the Tennessee area some of the first people in the world to get tattoos. Other than, of course, Otzi the Iceman. Otzi died 5,250 years ago, got frozen in ice, then was found in modern times with the oldest known tattoos on his flesh. While ancient people most likely did have tattoos thousands of years ago, no actual tattooing tools have been found that date back that far. Along with the turkey bones, investigators found other instruments used for giving tattoos. Researchers say the pigments used to actually make the tattoo designs were stored in seashells, which the tattooist would then dip the pointed turkey bone into, just like how a modern tattooist dips his needle into a little thimble of ink. But instead of ink, they were using pigments derived from plants. Based on the evidence, people used red or black pigment, and sometimes both. Cave skeleton. The complete skeleton of a man has been found at the bottom of a cave in Spain. Found in the region of Navarra, his remains date back 11,700 years and could be the most important prehistoric discovery in the area. The skeleton has been dubbed the Man of Loisu, and he is one of the oldest ever found in Spain. The discovery was made far from the entrance to the cave back in 2017 by a group of cave explorers. Experts determined that the man appears to have been dumped in the cave on purpose. Thanks to carbon dating, scientists have learned the man was only between the ages of 17 and 21 when he was left in the darkness of the spooky caves. The skeleton is complete and well preserved, but here's where things get violent. Researchers found a hole in the man's skull, suggestive of a projectile piercing his head prior to his death. They also believe the body had been wrapped in a shroud before being abandoned. Not only is the skeleton creepy because it's a skeleton, but the cave in which it was found is also pretty eerie and not very safe. Locals have known about the cave since ancient times, but nobody has ever explored it fully until just now. It's unclear why the guy was dumped into such an isolated place. There were no other bodies found inside the cave, so it was not a common burial place. Even though he was wrapped in a shroud and covered with ochre, it looks like he was murdered, and then someone disposed of his body. Colosseum ship battles. The ancient Romans built the Colosseum as the world's largest amphitheater and the centerpiece for the ancient city of Rome. Construction began in 70 AD under the Emperor Vespasian. It took 10 years to complete and had its opening ceremony in 80 AD. This ceremony was so impressive that it went on for 100 days. Have you ever been to the Colosseum, or is it on your bucket list? Let me know in the comments below. The Colosseum could fit up to 80,000 spectators. Can you imagine that many people back then? Even now, many stadiums seat around 70,000 to 100,000 people. So 80,000 people 2,000 years ago is super impressive. While the Colosseum is most famous for its bloody gladiator battles, it was used for a lot more than that. One of the craziest things the Romans did with the Colosseum was to fill the entire thing with water and then actually hold mock navy battles inside. Known as naumachia, the Romans would take prisoners of war or convicts and force them to fight like gladiators, but instead they would fight each other on small ships until one side was destroyed. They would use models of ships scaled down to fit and leave an island in the middle for the sailors to land, and then fight it out to the death. The earliest pretend naval battle like this on record was in 46 BC, when Julius Caesar built an artificial lake and had an Egyptian and Tyrian fleet fight it out in front of spectators. But doing this in the Colosseum doesn't really give you that much space. And how do you get the water to stay in there? A complex hydraulic system helped supply water to the Colosseum, but historians still can't quite figure out how the Romans organized these totally bizarre battles. Not a single piece of physical evidence of the Colosseum ship battles has ever been found. However, they have been described by many witnesses and ancient authors, so they are extremely well documented. This incredible feat of engineering was just one of many special events held in the Colosseum to entertain the masses. The Colosseum was used for almost 400 years. At least 400,000 people lost their lives in this amphitheater alone, along with 1 million animals. A new queen. While excavating at the vast necropolis of Saqqara in January, archaeologists discovered the 4,200-year-old tomb of a previously unknown Egyptian queen. Found near the pyramid of King Teti, who was only known to have two wives named Iput I and Kuit II, the funerary temple belonged to a woman named Queen Nate. Inscriptions on the wall identify her as Teti's wife and daughter. Archaeologist Zahi Hawass is heading the excavations at Saqqara and told the press that the team had discovered a pyramid dedicated to Nate nearby back in 2010, but they did not know who it belonged to until they found her funerary temple. Only 30% of Saqqara's contents have been excavated, while most of the sprawling site remains buried, so there is a lot there still to be found. The project that found Queen Nate's tomb was jointly undertaken by the Zahi Hawass Center of Egyptology and Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, or the SCA. Discoveries like this are rewriting ancient Egypt's history, especially when it comes to the 18th and 19th dynasties of the New Kingdom, which was when King Teti ruled. In addition to Queen Nate's funerary chamber, the team found an array of artifacts dating back roughly 3,000 years to the New Kingdom, including dozens of mummies, figurines, pottery, and 54 colorfully decorated coffins. SCA chief Mostafa Waziri said that the discovery of wooden coffins from the New Kingdom is a first at Saqqara. The sheer amount of new findings being made here reminds us of how little we truly know about ancient Egypt and how much is waiting to be uncovered. Medieval chapel. While investigating a church in Malta, archaeologists removed some floor tiles and found the remains of an even older structure beneath it. Dating back to the 17th century, the church Our Lady of Mercy is located in the village of Krendi, but what's underneath it? Believed to be a chapel, experts estimate that it dates back to sometime before 1500, during the late medieval period. It's smaller than the Baroque church that sits above it, having gone unnoticed until now. Beneath the medieval chapel, the team found additional archaeological remnants, suggesting the possible presence of a third structure, and that the site's use predates medieval times. It looks like humans have built and rebuilt over this specific spot for thousands of years. The historically rich region is also home to the Neolithic temples of Hajar-im and Manasdra, which are situated along the coastline about a half-mile away from the church. Dating back to the 4th millennium BC, they represent some of the world's oldest known sacred sites. This place is quite special. While it's clear that humans have a long-standing presence in Malta, the next step is to keep on looking underground to see how many layers of history they can find. Ukraine Burial Mound. A unique burial mound has been discovered in Ukraine, complete with a prehistoric stone circle. The burial mound and stone circle date back to around 5,500 years ago. The discovery itself is made during road work near a rural village. Compared to other burial mounds in the area, this one is absolutely enormous, with a length of 394 feet and a height of 21 feet. Excavators had to use bulldozers to remove the thin layers of earth to get at the archaeological evidence below. Archaeologists have so far discovered at least 24 burials inside of the huge mound. It was like a communal cemetery used by people from the Bronze Age, ancient Scythian warriors, and even by people in the Middle Ages. But what really excited archaeologists was when they found stone blocks forming a circle with a diameter of about 60 feet, known as a cromlech. Researchers can't figure out which came first, the burial mound or the stone circle. What they do know is that the people who built the circle were almost certainly nomads who lived throughout modern Ukraine and the surrounding area, while some of the later burials are significantly more recent. Back in the days when the burial mound was still being used, it would have been more of a giant complex, slightly similar to Stonehenge. It obviously didn't have stones quite as large, but the burial complex itself would have been much bigger than what you see today. It may have even been a site of great importance to different tribes and different people living in the general area. Buddha in the trash. A statue dating back 1,500 years has been found in the trash, and not just any statue either. There were actually 3 sculptures of the sleeping Buddha found amidst piles of trash outside the National Museum in Karachi. But these weren't recent archaeological discoveries. Instead, they were recovered statues that had been previously stolen by smugglers. The statues were rescued and handed over to the museum. For some strange reason, the museum did not preserve them and clean them up like you might expect. They simply tossed them in the trash, creating a pretty creepy sight with the faces of the ancient Buddhas sticking out between ripped garbage bags. According to officials, the Buddhas were recovered along with 395 other artifacts when police foiled a smuggling operation during a routine patrol. From what professional historians can deduce, the object came from the old Gandhara civilization. Even more disturbing is that they weren't the only relics dumped in the garbage. There were other rare artifacts found piled up in heaps of trash outside the museum. including pieces of history from the ancient Indus Valley culture, which date from between 3300 BC and 1300 BC. These people developed standardized weights and measurements. They created sculptures and figures out of metal and stone, and the proof of their amazing accomplishments can currently be found in the garbage in India. But what the heck are they doing there? The National Museum director Mohammed Shah defended his department and said, "We have put these sculptures over there ourselves." He claimed that since they were made of black schist stone, that nothing would happen to them. Apparently, they have run out of space inside the museum, so they decided to store everything in trash bags outside until they can build more room. Isn't this strange? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Basilica of the Holy Blood. When it comes to religious artifacts, there are many that are made up of strange body parts like bones and dried organs. The Basilica of the Holy Blood is home to one of the most sacred relics on the planet. The basilica itself isn't creepy or an artifact. It's a chapel from the 12th century, located in the medieval Belgian town of Bruges. But it's what's housed inside of the chapel that's a little disturbing. The basilica holds a sacred vial which is said to contain a cloth stained with the very real blood of Jesus Christ. The chapel itself is quite extraordinary, but it's really the blood of Jesus that piques the public's interest. According to legend, after the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea wiped blood off Jesus' body using a cloth. That cloth was preserved and has been kept for the past 2,000 years. It was first kept inside a safe in the Holy Land before the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin III, handed it over to his brother during the Second Crusade. His brother, the Count of Flanders Diedrich van de Elzas, then took the relic to Bruges, stored it in the basilica, and it has remained unopened and in the basilica to this very day. There are some who question the legitimacy of the blood. After all, anything said to be physical proof of Jesus is heavily controversial. However, there is a festival each year known as the Procession of the Holy Blood that brings thousands of tourists into the city as the Bishop of Bruges carries the vial through the streets. The first procession happened in 1291, and it is still happening over 720 years later. The blood cure. Speaking of gladiators, ancient Romans between the 1st and 6th century believed that draining the blood of gladiators and then drinking it could cure things, such as epilepsy. In fact, the use of gladiators' blood as a magical cure went on for hundreds of years during the Roman Republic. Gladiator fights were eventually outlawed in the year 325 AD, when Emperor Constantine I converted to Christianity and said that the fights to the death had no place during a time of civil and domestic peace. The barbaric fun was over, so people began to drink the blood of an executed individual instead, especially one that had been beheaded, since that was the next best thing. Because some people with epilepsy or fits recovered, physicians believed that the cure actually worked. Some modern textbooks on medicine report that as late as the 20th century, people still believed in the ancient magical practice of drinking the blood of a gladiator or a gladiator-like person to cure ailments. Gladiator blood wasn't the only thing that Romans thought would cure them. They also had a hunger for raw human livers as a way to treat medical issues. Apparently, executioners would have to fight back sick people who were trying to steal newly executed dead bodies because they wanted to harvest the livers to cure their diseases. Something that made this craze even worse was that seizures come and go, meaning that a lot of people would be convinced that they were cured after drinking blood or eating a liver and not experiencing a seizure for a long period of time. The frenzy for fresh blood and liver comes from the Roman belief that young and healthy males possess huge quantities of energy, and that by harnessing that energy at the point of death, you could absorb that person's healthiness. There were other beliefs during Roman times as well, such as that drinking gold would make the body indestructible. But of course, drinking gold was toxic and would basically just destroy your kidneys. Viking ship burials. Located off Denmark's eastern coast, the small island of Jarno is home to a Viking ship burial site called Kalvesene. Until recently, archaeologists only knew of 10 burials, but a newly conducted survey has uncovered 2 more, bringing the total number to 12. The origins of Kalvesene are still a mystery, but the burial site is made of monuments that, according to legend, are meant to commemorate a king. Now, thanks to some drawings and a map left behind by an Enlightenment antiquarian known as Old Worm, I'm sure that was his nickname, researchers are on the lookout for more burials. This 17th century map identified 20 ship burials at the site, So researchers compared the map to the site and used modern technology to try to find some more. Interestingly, the burials are unusual compared to other Danish sites from the same time period, and more closely resemble Viking burial sites in southern Sweden, calling into question the possible connections between the two regions. Lead study author Dr. Aaron Sebo said that 2 new mounds have been identified, and that one fits the profile for a typical Viking ship burial, while the other is ambiguous. She conceded that further study and excavation are necessary to know for sure that the mounds are ship burials, but pointed out that the site was well known throughout medieval Scandinavia, likely due to its placement along the route of a major trading center. So the chances are good, and it makes perfect sense. Not sure why people in history are often thought of as living in a vacuum. Of course they knew each other if they were in the same region. Researchers interpret the burials as representing a religious symbol relating to Norse mythology and the god Njord. Silla Kingdom Princess. A grave belonging to an ancient princess has been discovered literally overflowing with gold. Found in southeastern South Korea, according to the Jeongju National Research Institute for Cultural Heritage, a trove of treasures and ancient artifacts were found inside the tomb of a princess from the Silla Kingdom, which dates back to the 5th century. The Silla Kingdom ruled the majority of the Korean peninsula for at least 1,000 years, from between 57 BC and 935 AD. Researchers found a crown, pendants, gold chest ornaments, bracelets and rings, a knife decorated in silver, and hundreds of stones that were used to play the ancient board game Baduk, what you might know as Go. Normally, the stones from the board game were only found in tombs belonging to males from royal families, so archaeologists always thought that it could only be played by men. But this time, it was in the tomb of a girl. She was exempt from the rules, so she was most likely very special. All of these incredible artifacts were found at the huge excavation site, which was once the capital city of the legendary Silla Kingdom, home today to at least 300,000 people. Based on the abundance of gold, the woman must have been part of an aristocratic family and was probably younger than her other royal family members, seeing as her grave was actually smaller than many of the others. The best guess is that she was some kind of a princess. We know that she lived a life of luxury, but she died very young. Old Roman baths. Archaeologists in Spain have stumbled upon an ancient Roman bath complex preserved for thousands of years thanks to sand dunes. The discovery was announced by archaeologists with the University of Cádiz, who found not only the Roman bath, but also an ancient tomb. This Roman bathhouse is known as a thermae, and it was where the old citizens of Rome came to wash, get some exercise, relax, and of course, talk shop. The remains were perfectly preserved underneath the sand for about 2,000 years. Archaeologists had to excavate its walls, which were over 13 feet tall. The remains were found right on the beach, which is perhaps the most shocking part. Beachgoers at the Cañas de Meca beach have literally been walking over the remains of the ancient structure without even knowing it. As of right now, researchers have only excavated 2 of the building's rooms, but say that the entire structure once covered an area of over 2.5 acres. The Romans first seized this area of Spain in the 2nd century BC, and as is the Roman fashion, they established public baths. And down the coast, archaeologists also discovered salting pools and a tomb that dates back 4,000 years. Both structures were also preserved thanks to the sand dunes. The burial structure was filled with 7 corpses, though researchers don't know right now who they were or exactly which culture they belong to. And now for number 5. But first, want to say a big thank you to Steve Payne and Jazzy J. Sky. Thanks so much for spending time with us and supporting Origins Explained. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Decorated skull. Archaeologists claim to have discovered human skulls that date back 9,500 years. These skulls were decorated in a very creepy fashion. They were modeled after real faces using clay, then colored to create disturbingly lifelike features. They were found inside of a burial site at a prehistoric village in modern Syria, near the capital of Damascus. Each skull was found inside the same pit, all of them resting in a pile. Even more ghoulish is that they were found underneath the remains of an infant, according to French archaeologist Daniel Storger. Unfortunately, we're not really sure what the ancient decorated skulls were used for. The realism is beyond impressive considering how old they are. They may have been someone's attempt at copying the faces of the dead, and they were almost certainly used in mysterious rituals. What makes them so unique is that archaeologists have never found anything else like them. These are completely unique in Syrian burials and everywhere else in the world, leading scientists to question just why they were made in the first place and why nobody ever tried to duplicate them. Poison immunity. Betrayal, assassination, and death by poison were all things that ancient Roman emperors and politicians had to worry about. They were constantly under threat and in need of better methods for protecting themselves and holding on to their power. Some believed that the best way to avoid being poisoned was to drink as many poisons as possible to become immune. They believed that by subjecting themselves purposely to dangerous poisons little by little, they could gain immunity and not have to worry so much about getting killed by their enemies, although they still had to worry about getting stabbed in the back. But anyway, the most famous king who tried to do this was Mithridates VI, who ruled over a small kingdom near Rome. Not only did he hire a taste tester to first check his food for poison, but he also slowly accustomed himself to being poisoned. He was traumatized by the death of his father, who was killed in 120 BC by poison given to him during a feast. Mithridates VI decided he would never die like his father, and so he was careful to ingest doses that were just below the level of lethality. He believed that the constant exposure would give him superpowers, and to be honest, it doesn't seem that crazy of an idea, does it? He also had to worry about his mother trying to kill him. When his father died, his mother Laodice VI took over and wanted his younger brother to take the throne. Mithridates VI went into hiding, carefully consuming poison until he could raise an army and take over. When he lived in the wilderness, the story goes he was helped by Scythian shamans who helped him come up with the formula that would make him immune to many poisons. He successfully seized the throne and had his mother and brother arrested and executed. At first, he was on friendly terms with the Romans, but things eventually turned sour as he kept expanding and conquering neighboring kingdoms. After many wars, the Romans considered him a threat and eventually forced him to flee. Rather than fall into enemy hands, he decided to commit suicide by drinking poison. It didn't go so well because he actually was immune and he didn't die. The ironic twist of fate. He was eventually caught and soon ripped apart by angry rebels. During this time, rumors spread of the semi-mythical concoction that would make you immune to any poison or serve as an antidote. This became known as a Mithridate or Mithridati in honor of Mithridates VI, and during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it became a highly sought-after drug, even though no one really knew exactly what was in it. DNA rewrites history. When it comes to untangling the messy web of human migration throughout history, experts have little to go on other than the existing fossil record, which is pretty spotty. There are many gaps and theories. A recent DNA analysis of a skull belonging to a woman who lived in what is now Romania around 35,000 years ago is upending researchers' understanding of our ancestors' movement after the first humans left Africa roughly 80,000 years ago. DNA evidence from people who lived in Europe and Asia during the last glacial maximum between 24,000 and 19,000 years ago shows low genetic diversity compared to ancient African skeletons. Scientists expected to see similar results when they tested the 35,000-year-old skull from Romania. But the woman, nicknamed Peștera Murerii I, showed a much higher level of genetic diversity than the genomes of later European fossils. Study author Matthias Jacobson explained that her DNA more closely resembled modern Europeans than people who lived there 5,000 years earlier, but that she was also clearly not a direct ancestor of those living there today. Instead, Peștera is a predecessor of the hunter-gatherers who inhabited Europe until the end of the last ice age. She also has less Neanderthal DNA than researchers expect to find based on the shape of her skull, and about half as much as people who lived 5,000 years before her time. The findings indicate that the greatest loss of genetic diversity among people who migrated out of Africa occurred during the last ice age, and that until then, our ancestors maintained their genetic diversity for the most part. Discoveries like this also challenge the commonly accepted belief that humans left Africa in a bottleneck, and that they perhaps departed in waves rather than all at once. But because DNA evidence dating this far back is lacking, there are still missing pieces of the puzzle waiting to be identified. Roman beauty. Beauty was wildly important to ancient Roman women, and things haven't changed much in the past 2,000 years. They used makeup and beauty products to the same extent that people do today. The only difference was the types of ingredients. One of the most popular beauty products was the beauty mask. These masks were usually a rather disgusting mixture of sweat from sheep's wool, animal urine, bile, ground oyster shells, and even fresh placenta. So relaxing. But before you go denouncing the Romans for being gross, some of these ingredients are still used today in beauty masks. They also wore tons of perfume, obviously to cover the stench of all of these ingredients. Another popular beauty practice was bathing in donkey milk. People would also whiten their skin using animal dung, smelly, and lead, which was toxic. Swan fat was used to get rid of wrinkles. Burnt cork was used as a lash thickener. Long lashes were also a way to tell the world that you practiced chastity, as women who were a little more risque were believed to have eyelashes that always fell out. Dark eyebrows, preferably a unibrow, were all the rage. They wore nail polish and kept their nails short, and white teeth were prized possessions. Even if they weren't your own, they could be made from bone, ivory, and paste. After Cleopatra visited Rome in 46 BC, she greatly influenced Roman makeup. Cleopatra wore red ochre on her lips, green eyeshadow made from malachite, blue eyeshadow made from lapis stone, and black coal for her eyes. Red lips especially became a huge sensation. All the Roman women began using beetle juice and bromine to make their lips as red as possible. Talpiot's tomb. In 1980, archaeologists in Jerusalem's East Talpiot neighborhood discovered a rock-cut tomb dating back to sometime between 538 BC and 70 AD during the Second Temple period. By all appearances, the burial belonged to a wealthy first-century Jewish family. But in a 2007 press conference, filmmakers James Cameron and Simcha Jacobovici announced that the tomb contained an ossuary bearing the inscription, "Jesus, son of Joseph." Biblical archaeology was in the news once again. They made a show called The Lost Tomb of Jesus that aired on the Discovery Channel. The rock-cut tomb contains niches for ossuaries, or boxes with the bones of dead people. The pair claimed that the burial tomb contained the remains of Jesus' mother Mary, as well as Mary Magdalene and Judah. Things took an even more bizarre turn when the filmmakers further suggested that the inscription on one of the tomb's ossuaries identifies Judah as Jesus' son. Christians and scholars alike immediately refuted these bold claims, pointing out that Jesus and his family were poor, which conflicts with the seemingly wealthy burial. Additionally, the family was from Galilee and would therefore not be laid to rest in Jerusalem. Scholars argue that the ossuary lacks terminology such as Master or Messiah, which would have been customary if the tomb truly belonged to Jesus. DNA tests performed on the bones from two of the ossuaries determined that the individuals were not related, but offered no clues as to who they were. While the academic community at large denies that the tomb belonged to Jesus, the identities of its occupants remains open to speculation. Dozens of tombs. It may not seem rare to discover an ancient Egyptian tomb, especially with the sheer number of them that have made headlines in recent years. But each burial tells a story unique to the person inside and the time period in which they lived. They help experts piece together a more complete picture of Egypt's history. In April, archaeologists announced the discovery of 110 ancient Egyptian tombs spanning 3 periods of history, including before the pyramids were built, in the Qam al-Khalejan area along the Nile Delta, around 93 miles northeast of Cairo. 68 of the burials date back to around 3300 BC, during the late pre-dynastic period, when the Nile Valley was still separated into Upper and Lower Egypt. These oval-shaped graves appear to be connected with the pre-dynastic Buto culture, with most of the deceased laid to rest in a squatting position, with their head facing west. The team also found a baby buried in a jar, which was a relatively common but not very well understood custom, according to archaeologist Ayman Ashmawi. 5 tombs are from a time known as the Naqada III culture, during the decades leading up to Egypt's unification in 3000 BC. The rest of the graves are from between 1782 and 1750 BC, which was an intermediary period between the Middle and New Kingdoms. It was during this time that the controversial Hyksos dynasty ruled for over a century. Speaking with Smithsonian Magazine, Egyptologist Salima Ikram described the cemetery as extremely interesting because it contains burials from some of Egypt's earliest periods, as well as the time of the Hyksos. She explained that experts are still trying to understand how the Hyksos and the Egyptians coexisted and to what degree the former took on Egyptian traditions. Spelling mistakes. An ancient Egyptian writing board dating back to sometime between 1981 and 1802 BC during the Middle Kingdom period proves that correcting students' work is an educational tradition dating back thousands of years. Now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it was once used by scribes for practicing their penmanship as they copied texts. Scribes were entrusted with highly important tasks, including extensive and accurate record-keeping and correspondence. For this reason, they began their training during childhood, learning how to compose letters, wills, and tax forms and hieroglyphics under a master scribe. The writing board reflects a simplified cursive style of hieroglyphics that was developed around 3000 BC as a way to expedite the laborious process of composing administrative and religious documents. Do you remember the feeling from school? Did you have to learn how to write in cursive? See, times haven't changed that much. Used by a student named N.Y. Su, it contains correspondence written to the scholar's brother, He Su. Ancient depictions show scribes sitting on the ground holding tablets similar to the one N.Y. Su used. These writing boards were used and reused over and over, and in this particular example and many others, the master scribe's corrections appear in red ink, much like those of a modern teacher. How is this still the same? Fascinating finds like this reflect the foundations of written communication, bringing us to a time around 4,000 years ago, when a young student's skills were put to the test in strikingly similar ways that they are today. A pregnant mummy. While examining what they thought was the mummy of an ancient Egyptian priest named Hor-Jehuti, a team of experts got quite the shock. They put the coffin through a scan and noticed some tiny foot bones in the individual's abdomen. Further analysis confirmed that the mummy contained the remains of a fetus. Ergo, not a male priest, that's for sure. It's the first known example of a deliberately mummified pregnant woman, begging the questions of who she was, why she and her unborn baby were mummified, and why the fetus was not removed from her body prior to the mummification process. Scientists appropriately named her the Mysterious Lady of the National Museum of Warsaw. Donated to the University of Warsaw in 1826, the sarcophagus and mummy, which were allegedly found in Thebes, were thought to be female until the coffin's inscriptions were translated in 1920, suggesting that it contained a male specimen. Scientists got their first credible inklings that the mummy is female in 2016, when computer tomography revealed a delicate bone structure and missing male organs. While the sarcophagus was indeed made for a male mummy, it somehow ended up being a vessel for a pregnant woman. This is likely due to rampant 19th century looting, which often saw mix-up between mummies and their coffins. Unfortunately, as a result, researchers may never know who the woman was, where she came from, or why she seems to be an exception to traditional burial customs. Viking caves. Almost 1,100 years ago, a volcano erupted in Iceland. The Vikings had arrived just before, and this eruption must have scared them to death, and most likely made them believe that Ragnarok was coming. Once the lava cooled, it created caves and tunnels. The Vikings entered a cave and created a boat-shaped structure made out of rocks and sacrificed all kinds of animals there to appease the gods. Besides burnt animal bones, archaeologists were shocked to find beads and minerals that came all the way from the Middle East, indicating that the Vikings had quite an extensive trade network. If you want to experience a pristine Viking village that will have you feeling as though you were back in the days of the ancient Scandinavian warriors, you should definitely visit Hub, Iceland. The village is complete with Viking huts, a spooky tunnel, and even a dungeon underneath a boulder. While it is not actually an ancient village, it was recreated to the last detail and is open for visitors to come and see what life was like in the past. It was made to look exactly like a traditional Viking village from around the 10th century. It's surrounded by cows and horses grazing in the fields, beautiful mountains, and it was finally used just recently in a movie from Universal Studios called Vikingur, directed by a local Icelandic named Baltazar Kormakur. Creepy figurines. Some very mysterious Neolithic figurines have been discovered in Jordan. The figurines date back 10,000 years and were crafted by our Neolithic ancestors and placed in burials. This was a time when humans began expanding throughout the Middle East. However, very little in the way of archaeological artifacts have been found from this time. According to Juan José Ibáñez, who was working closely with the discovery, archaeologists found a unique assemblage of artifacts made from flint at the archaeological site of Karaisin. The artifacts appear to depict either humans or perhaps a god or goddess. They were discovered inside burials and apparently crafted specifically for mortuary rituals. And while it's undetermined whether these creepy figures were made to depict men or monster, or otherworldly visitor, they are still pretty fascinating. Archaeologists say the figurines were cult objects. This means they were vehicles of a magic hand that would have only been used in ceremonies seen as highly symbolic or religious. Though what types of religion were practiced 10,000 years ago is still a mystery to historians and archaeologists. All we know is that the figures had something to do with the dead. The horse politician. The Roman Emperor Caligula loved one of his horses so much that, according to the ancient historian Suetonius, he planned to make the horse consul and have a say in government. But did he really do it? The horse named Incitatus received an ivory manger, a marble stall, a collar made from jewels, and his own house. The servants would feed the animal oats blended with flakes of gold. Caligula is one of the most notorious emperors in Roman history, known for his madness and brutality. When he first came to power, he was beloved, but he got sick with a mysterious illness and was never the same. He became cruel and crazy, feeding prisoners to wild beasts because he was bored, sleeping with other men's wives, declaring he was a god, speaking with the moon, wasting money and causing starvation. There are many stories. It's hard to separate fact from fiction since many of the authors hated him or wrote down rumors, but he did often try to humiliate members of the Senate, and appointing his horse as consul was the ultimate insult. A consul was the highest elected political office between 509 and 27 BC. If successful, Caligula would have created the first equine official in Rome. Some historians have suggested that Caligula was in fact trying to embarrass and humiliate the senators and the other elite members of the political circus in Rome by giving his horse a higher position of public office than them. In a way, he wanted to show that his horse was more important than the meaningless and useless senators, and that their job was so easy, even a horse could do it. So was he crazy or a political mastermind? It looks like the former. His constant mocking and evil ways became the death of him, and he was murdered by officers within his own guard. Incitatus was not officially granted his position. White Monument. Located in the Syrian town of Tal Banat, a burial mound that can be seen for miles around, known as White Monument, may be the world's oldest known war monument. Previously thought to be an ancient mass grave of enemy fighters, researchers now believe that the mound contains the burials of local soldiers who died in battle during the 3rd millennium BC. Unlike similar sites throughout Syria, which contain haphazardly tossed bodies, the Tal Banat site burials appear carefully assembled, suggesting that the site was built as a tribute to the dead. Speaking with The Guardian, lead study author Professor Ann Porter explained that while researchers don't know whether the dead had won or lost in battle, it's evident that their bodies were deliberately relocated to the site from elsewhere, suggesting that ancient people found ways to recognize fallen warriors, much as we still do today. In addition to being dedicated to the state military, the mound may contain the remains of enemy soldiers. While unproven, these findings may call for a re-examination of the meanings of other burial mounds throughout Syria. A brewery. We humans have always wanted an excuse to let loose and relax every once in a while, and of course, ancient people were no different, as the discovery of the world's oldest industrial-scale brewery proves. Found earlier this year at a funerary site in North Abydos, the production facility dates back over 5,000 years, long before the pyramids were built. The brewery was likely built around 3150 BC, during the reign of King Narmer. The site consists of 8 large beer production areas with around 40 earthenware pots in each. These vessels, which were held in place by clay levers, were used for heating grains and water. Evidence suggests that the beer played a role in sacrificial rites, and that the brewery may have even been built solely for supplying royal rituals, according to a statement from Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Lead archaeologist Ahmed Shawkat revealed that the site was first explored over a century ago by British archaeologist T. Eric Peat, who believed he had found equipment for drying grain and protecting it against rot. A fresh look after its rediscovery in 2018 suggests, however, that these implements were used for making beer, and that the facility was capable of producing 5,900 gallons at a time, enough for every person in a 40,000-seat stadium to have a pint, as archaeologist Matthew Adams pointed out. This site also speaks to the abundant wealth during the Pharaonic period, during which time Narmer is said to have united Upper and Lower Egypt. prehistoric Peruvian huntress. Archaeologists have made a truly amazing discovery in Peru. They have found the remains of a young woman hunter who lived in the region 9,000 years ago. So far, all the evidence suggests that this woman was only one among many female hunters who tracked down and killed big game animals. What this means is that women likely had a much larger role in hunting than previously believed, shattering the idea of classic hunter-gatherer roles, with the men hunting and the women gathering. It turns out the duties may have been shared. The discovery came from a grave high up in the mountains at the site of Huila Maya Patya. According to Randall Haas, an archaeologist from the University of California, he and other researchers uncovered stone tools and projectiles buried with the woman's skeleton. At first, they thought they had dug up the body of a great chief, a he-chief. It wasn't until the bones were analyzed that researchers realized they were dealing with a woman, a very young woman at that, who died between the age of 17 and 19. After this discovery, there was a study that looked at the published records of almost 430 burials across the Americas. What they discovered were 27 humans buried alongside their hunting tools. 11 of the bodies were female, and 15 were male. This means that before societies really began to take root, men and women might have been on much more equal footing, at least in the world of hunting. The Black Obelisk. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III is a creepy artifact that looks like it belongs in the tomb of an ancient necromancer. Instead, it was originally built to celebrate the successful military campaigns of King Shalmaneser III of the Assyrian Empire. The obelisk was erected back in 825 BC in the courtyard of a central, possibly administrative building in the city of Kalu, also known as Nimrud. The obelisk is carved with 4 different scenes depicting various military achievements by the Assyrian king. On most of the sides, it shows various scenes of the king receiving tribute, though there is one side of the obelisk completely covered in pictures of strange animals. They seem to be humanoid in nature, almost like humans mixed with monkeys or apes. These bizarre animals are chained and kept on leashes, and scientists haven't quite figured out what the weird creatures could possibly be. As for the place in which the obelisk was found, it was once the capital city of the entire Assyrian Empire. Kalu was a prosperous city throughout much of the empire's significance until eventually it was ripped asunder by civil war and turned into a dusty ruin. Today, the city is located in modern-day Iraq. The Roman Banquet. The Roman banquet was probably just the way you would imagine it today in your mind. Picture Romans in togas stretched out on long chairs with goblets of wine and dozens upon dozens of exotic foods being served literally on silver platters. But while there's nothing inherently crazy about the excess of the ancient Roman banquet, just wait until you hear exactly what kinds of food these people were eating, from peacock tongue to fried dormice, which was actually a fat little mouse. Keep in mind that these banquets reached their peak between 98 and 117 AD, at a time when the Roman Empire stretched from Baghdad to Britain. Foods and animals would come from all over. Many of these banquets were excellent opportunities for someone to poison one of their enemies by slipping something into their wine. These really were the wildest and most elite parties of the time. Plus, you could show off your power and wealth. Some of the weirder dishes that would be served at a Roman banquet were wild sow's udders, stuffed snails, not so bad, ostrich, and sugarcane. That sounds nice. One of the only surviving cookbooks from the Roman Empire, written by Marcus Gavius Apicius, details at least 400 recipes, including some for camel heels, parrot, pheasant, rabbit, sausages made from brain, flamingo tongues, and so much more. Basically, if you want to learn how to cook like the Romans, you can. The Kennewick Man. Considered one of North America's most controversial archaeological discoveries of all time, a skeleton known as the Kennewick Man was found by 2 students in 1996 in Washington state. It would be natural to assume that the remains, which date back 8,500 years, are of a Native American. Consequently, the local indigenous community claimed rights to the skeleton based on shared ancestry. Scientists challenged this assertion, arguing that the individual more closely resembled Japanese, Ainu, and Polynesian populations. If this were true, it would wildly challenge our long-held assumptions about who arrived in America first and where they came from. The researchers won the case in court and were permitted to continue studying the Kennewick Man in hopes of determining his ethnicity. A 2015 study analyzing his genome confirmed that the Kennewick man's DNA more closely identifies with Native American populations than any other group worldwide. Situations like this are unfortunately all too common, according to Smithsonian Magazine's Douglas Preston, who explained in 2014 that Native American graves and archaeological sites have been wrongfully looted throughout history. Simply put, while the Kennewick man was not deliberately stolen from an indigenous site, there is something to be said for how his ethnicity remained in question for so many years. But this mystery has finally been put to rest. Hundreds of tombs. Archaeologists have just discovered around 250 rock-cut tombs dating back to different periods in the Old Kingdom and the Ptolemaic dynasty in the Upper Egyptian province of Sohag. The Old Kingdom burials date back between roughly 2700 and 2200 BC, according to Mustafa Waziri, the Secretary General of the SCA, and they are encompassed by an entrance leading to a burial room and a well. One such tomb bears faint remains of hieroglyphics identifying it as a sacrificial chamber. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which lasted around 300 years, ended around 30 BC with the death of Cleopatra. In addition to actual human remains, the team found an array of artifacts dedicated to ancient Egyptian deities, including pottery and votive objects, animal bones, and limestone remnants that could be funerary plates dating as far back as the 6th dynasty. This is one of several recent discoveries that the Egyptian government hopes will revive its ailing tourism industry in the aftermath of a 2011 political uprising and amid the ongoing global coronavirus pandemic. Ancient string. Researchers have stumbled upon the very first evidence that Neanderthals were able to make string. As mundane and boring as this might sound, it's actually quite fascinating. This discovery means that our primitive ancestors figured out not only how to use stone tools, but how to turn plant fibers into string, which was arguably the most important invention ever, as it gave rise to every invention that came after. Imagine all the things you can make and do with string. Catch fish, trap animals, make jewelry, make clothes, connect things. I mean, the possibilities thousands of years ago were endless. The discovery was made when researchers spotted a white splotch on a stone tool once used by a Neanderthal. When they checked the stone tool using a microscope, they discovered fibers. Closer examination recognized the fibers as belonging to a string. According to the scientists who made the discovery at Kenyon College in Ohio, the fact that Neanderthals could make string suggests they could make other things as well, such as bags and fabrics. If you're wondering just how old the string is, think back to about 50,000 years to southeastern France. The stone tool came from an archaeological site in the Rhône River Valley. The string itself was made from fiber taken from the inner layer of bark of local trees. Neanderthals twisted bundles of fiber together until they had weaved a perfectly strong string that could be used for reinforcing tools or even making loincloths, though there has never actually been any evidence suggesting that Neanderthals ran around covering themselves. 6,000-year-old massacre. A massacre that happened 6,000 years ago may have been one of the oldest instances ever of indiscriminate killing. The ancient site was found in Croatia. An archaeologist from the Institute for Anthropological Research in Croatia used genetic analysis to try and figure out just what happened for all these people to have been buried in such a ghoulish way. There were 41 people killed here and buried in a mass grave. The genetic study done was one of the largest ever in the history of archaeology. 38 out of the 41 individuals were analyzed for genetics. What researchers found is that they all belonged to the Lasinja culture from the Copper Age. The grave was filled with women and men in equal numbers, with about half being children and half being adults. Some of the people in the burial were related, others were simply part of the population, but they all shared common ancestry. The surprise here is that all the people were from the same place and the same culture. Normally in mass burials, the people slaughtered are part of a battle. It looks like here there was a large-scale killing that took place that had nothing to do with regular war. Could have happened because of an increase in population size and a scarcity of resources. There could have been a civil revolt. Scientists don't really know the answers. What they do know is that the people were slaughtered indiscriminately, regardless of age or gender, and then dumped inside of a pit and buried. The Lady Gladiators. Not many people know the truth about gladiators. Gladiators were not strictly male, nor were they always prisoners forced to fight to the death. A lot of gladiator battles didn't even end in death. And for that matter, there were elite gladiator women known as gladiatrix. The beginnings for gladiator women were definitely a bit dubious. Because male gladiators fought shirtless, it was decreed that the women would also fight shirtless. This began as more of a humorous spectacle for a largely male audience. The female gladiators would still fight with swords and shields, but they would usually be set against enemies with a rather dwarf-like stature so that the audience would laugh. But they weren't laughing for long. Female gladiators began to be taken seriously, and they also fought against other, even more ferocious female gladiators and wild animals. They became a rare breed of brutal warrior women. Later on, they were known as Amazons in the events, and would sometimes fight from a cart or a chariot. And here's the other thing about gladiators. Some of those who signed up to fight in the Colosseum were people from the middle class who wanted to earn extra money. The prize for winning a gladiator tournament was enormous, and it often came with a quick 15 minutes of fame. Before female gladiator battles were eventually outlawed, many of the most skilled and fearsome warriors in the arena were middle-class women collecting serious bank. This allowed many of the gladiatrix to move away from their fathers or husbands and live alone in prosperity. They were by no means common, but were a shocking and rare event to witness for the Roman public. Ancient gold artifacts. Around 3,800 years ago, a 20-year-old woman died and was laid to rest in a fetal position in what is now Tübingen, Germany. She was buried with just one grave good, a golden spiral that she may have used as a hair accessory. The gold's chemical composition indicates that it may have been sourced from Cornwall, England, according to researchers. Not only are gold finds rare in southwestern Germany, the object constitutes the oldest known gold artifact ever discovered in the region. In a statement, the team who examined the spiral said that it serves as evidence that Western cultural groups, such as from Britain and France, gained increasing influence over Central Europe in the first half of the second millennium BC. The deceased woman's remains show no signs of illness or injury, leaving her cause of death a mystery. She was likely of high-ranking status, as evidenced by her possession of a gold object, and radiocarbon dating revealed that she passed away sometime between 1850 and 1700 BC. There are no written records detailing her identity because writing had not yet spread to southwestern Germany, and there is a good chance that researchers will never know exactly who she was. Church and Temple. Earlier this year, archaeologists announced the discovery of the remnants of a Ptolemaic-era temple, a Roman fort, and an early Coptic church at the Shiha Fort archaeological site in Aswan, all together. Dating back to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which began roughly 20 years after Alexander's death in 323 BC and lasted until around 30 BC, the temple ruins were decorated with a partially complete sandstone panel featuring a Roman emperor standing next to an altar featuring an unknown deity. The panel, although incomplete, clearly marks the temple's entrance. These recent findings build upon the original excavations carried out by German archaeologist Hermann Juncker from 1920 to 1922. The Coptic church that once stood at the site had a red brick vault, and the building was surrounded by a mud brick wall measuring nearly 7 feet wide. There are 4 rooms on the northern side of the church, along with a long hallway and a staircase. Kilns that were once used for baking pottery were found on the structure's south side, and its eastern side contains stone tiles. These findings are just the beginning of what the site has to offer in a historical context, and more is surely to come upon further analysis. You know it. Lost Italian Village. After being submerged for 70 years, an old Italian village has re-emerged from a lake like the phoenix rising from the ashes. Well, not quite the same, but still pretty cool. For the past 7 decades, the only visible part of the village of Curon has been a lonely church tower rising out of the water. The iconic 14th century village was once home to around 1,000 people, but government officials decided to build a dam for a nearby hydroelectric plant. The entire place was covered with water. The only thing that remained was the bell tower poking out of the lake that has drawn tourists from all over the world. When the water freezes, you can actually go up to it and touch it. Now, more recently, the lost town began resurfacing, at least temporarily. Workers had to drain the lake to make repairs to the hydroelectric plant. This exposed stone steps, arched cellars, medieval buildings, and so much more. The big bummer is that it happened during the pandemic and there were no tourists around to see it. Plus, the village was only revealed for a handful of weeks until maintenance was done, and the area was flooded once again. If you were hoping to get a glimpse of a flooded Italian village, you've missed your chance. You might have to wait another 70 years until maintenance is done again. Or you can visit the town in the winter when the lake is covered in ice and you can go skating. Medieval birthing girdle. One of the most dangerous things a woman could do throughout history and even today is give birth. Medieval medicine was a nightmare, and archaeologists have found one of the creepiest and most bizarre contraptions used by doctors about 500 years ago. It's called the birthing girdle, and it was found soaked in delivery fluid, milk, and honey. The girdle was used to help a woman survive childbirth. It was a length of parchment about 9 feet long that was wrapped around the swollen belly. How did this help? The parchment would be covered in prayers and religious symbols. The prayers and symbols were believed to protect the woman from any harm that would come to her during the birth. This wouldn't really pass a safety inspection in today's hospitals, but back in the 15th century, birthing girdles were all the rage because there wasn't much else they could do. For the first time, scientists have actually found one that was in good shape. According to Catherine Rudy with the University of St. Andrews, the birthing girdle came from 15th century England and was discovered with traces of birthing fluid and blood on it, suggesting the woman was still wearing it while pushing out her baby. But what kinds of things would be written on the birthing girdle? It would be scrawled with the names of apostles and saints, and it would have pleased to God for the woman not to be injured during childbirth. In other words, it was a medieval lucky charm. Roman toilets. Ancient Rome was not known for its hygiene, especially if you needed to use the toilet. At one point, there were 144 public latrines in Rome. These communal bathrooms were set up with toilets in rows next to each other, and it was actually a whole experience. People would go to sit and read, share stories, give out dinner invitations, what have you. The toilets, of course, didn't flush, but they were tied into internal plumbing and sewer systems with running water underneath them. As you can imagine, because so many people were hanging out in public toilets as if they were at the local pub, they weren't that sanitary. Instead of using toilet paper, Romans used a shared sponge for wiping their behinds. Of course, rinsed out in a bucket of vinegar or salt water after each use, to be polite to the next person. Public urinals were a little different. Buckets from these urinals were regularly collected to be used at the laundromat. Why? Because pee is actually an excellent detergent. Collectors had public contracts to go around town collecting all the urine, which would then be used to clean the clothes. They would soak the clothes in pee and stomp on it with their feet. Don't worry, they would put all kinds of perfumes and things on it afterwards. Actually, the ancient Romans used human and animal urine on a pretty daily basis. Whereas we in modern times are grossed out by the smallest splash of urine, Romans also used urine as mouthwash. Just like with the laundry, because urine contains ammonia, something used today in commercial cleaning products, it was effective at removing dirt from a person's teeth. It did in fact make Roman teeth whiter. Please don't try this at home. This is for educational purposes only. Ancient dagger. Archaeologists recently discovered a lost village of 4 ancient buildings dating back between the 14th and 17th centuries in Bothwell, Scotland. Excavations at the site turned up fragments of cooking vessels, a tobacco pipe, nails, a spindle whorl that was used for weaving, a whetstone that was used for sharpening tools, 2 17th century coins, evidence of metalworking, and what they believe is an iron dagger. The dagger and some of the other objects may have been deposited as part of a protective ritual to guard the house or its inhabitants against harm. This practice, including the reuse of prehistoric objects in medieval settings, is well documented throughout history. It appears as though the dagger was sheathed when it was buried, said the researcher to the Scotsman, adding that the weapon was likely still intact and usable at the time. The centuries-old homes are located near the Netherton Cross, a 10th century monument, and Bothwell Bridge, where a battle ending the Covenanter Rebellion in Scotland occurred in 1679. The nearby community may have been damaged by the skirmish, according to the report. During the 18th century, the Duke of Hamilton repurposed the territory as parkland, and a highway eventually covered what was left of the village. A huge lost city. Archaeologists were stunned earlier this year when they discovered ancient Egypt's largest known city to date. Known as the Rise of Aten, the lost metropolis dates back roughly 3,400 years to the reign of Amenhotep III and was found buried beneath the sand on the western bank of Luxor. It is the greatest discovery since King Tut's tomb was found in the 20s. More information about the city is slowly coming to light. Archaeologists were actually looking for Tutankhamun's mortuary temple, but found this whole city instead. World-famous Egyptologist Zahi Hawass said in a statement that the ruins are remarkably intact. There are remains of houses with walls up to 10 feet high, lining organized streets. And ordinary, everyday objects like rings, pottery vessels, pots for carrying meat, and spinning and weaving tools sit inside the rooms, as if everyone just up and left, leaving everything abandoned just like someone left there yesterday. Except it wasn't yesterday, it was thousands of years ago. There are workshops, including one that was used for manufacturing mud bricks, as well as production facilities, housing, metal making and glass making equipment, molds for making amulets, and more. There was also a bakery containing ovens and large pottery, showing that it was probably the most popular bakery in town, and it made bread for a large number of people. The size of the city was huge, and it probably served as a precedent for the city of Akhetaten. The city was alive and thriving under the reign of King Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, who was co-ruler. The rise of Aten is not without a handful of unusual discoveries, including the strange burial of a skeleton with outstretched arms and rope wrapped around the knees. We still don't know why this lost city was abandoned, but it looks like everyone left and resettled in Armana for unknown reasons. Archaeologists are working hard to figure it out. They have their work cut out for them. The oldest gold. Archaeologists in Germany have discovered the country's oldest golden artifact. It came from the southwest when researchers excavated a Neolithic burial site containing the corpse of a woman in the fetal position. The only object found inside the woman's burial was a ring of gold that may have been part of a hair ornament. What's truly mysterious is that the gold spiral probably came from Britain and was transported to the continent via a complicated trading network that existed several thousand years ago. The woman's remains were carbon dated, placing her death between 1850 and 1700 BC. She was likely someone of high status because of the gold, which also contains 20% silver and traces of platinum and tin. The composition suggests the natural gold comes from a river, specifically an English river. This is the oldest piece of gold jewelry found in Germany, and suggests that even thousands of years ago, the early people living in the United Kingdom had a significant influence over Central Europe. Remember, this is back in the 2nd century BC. Even back then, the UK was gaining a global foothold through trade. Head in a cave. Inside of an Italian cave, a single skull has been discovered miles away from its original burial site. According to Maria Giovanna Belcastro with the University of Bologna, the head was separated from its body, taken away by flowing water, and then lost deep down inside of the cave. It was originally discovered in 2015, deep in a gypsum cave called Marcel Lubon's Cave. While it's true that some caves were used as burial grounds in ancient Italy, the simple fact that no other human bones have been found here confused archaeologists, at least at first. There was nothing except a skull, and even the skull was missing its lower jaw. Based on the structure of the bones, the skull belonged to a woman somewhere between 24 and 35 when she died. The skull dates back to around 3600 BC, over 5,000 years ago during what is known as the Neolithic period. From what researchers can gather, the creepy skull rolled away from its head, probably after being severed during a funeral ritual, got moved by something like a flood, and then was carried all the way to the mouth of the cave, where over the centuries, flowing water pushed it deeper and deeper, until it finally wound up in the bottom. So far, the body has not been found. Romans and elephants. The Romans had an obsession with war elephants. It all started in 280 BC when the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy II lent out some elephants to King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek kingdom. King Pyrrhus then used his new elephants to attack the Romans, resulting in a massive victory. This time, the Romans had no idea how to defend against elephants. But the next time that the Romans were attacked by elephants, they were prepared. They threw pots of fire to scare the beasts, they had special anti-elephant war devices, and they defeated them pretty easily the second time around. Romans then got their own elephants after 275 BC, when the Pyrrhic War came to an end. They definitely recognized their military potential. The Romans took on this powerful animal and used them in many military campaigns. The story goes that they also brought an elephant when they invaded Britain. The Britons didn't exactly communicate with faraway lands, and none of them knew what an elephant was. When they first saw the giant beast covered with armor, carrying archers in a tower on its back, they fled, allowing the Romans to cross over. I don't blame them. It must have looked like an army of aliens accompanied by mythical beasts. Suffice it to say, the Romans eventually took over Britain. Thanks for watching! What did you think was the craziest thing? What is something that you would try today? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!